This is Frank Consello with the Crested Butte is Home podcast, and my guest this week is David Scheefer, who has lived a life in the mountains starting way back when he was a kid growing up in Lake Placid, and he was able to do things like ride the bobsled course there at the old Olympic venue. And eventually he found himself here in the Gunnison Valley, spent a lot of his time up in Ohio City, which is in the Quartz Creek Valley. And if you haven't been up to Ohio City and Pitkin in that area, it's not talked about as much as Crested Butte in some other areas, but it is beautiful up there, and you should go check it out. We had a lot to talk about, everything from some of the construction projects he's done to some of the early days of backcountry skiing, including what may have been the first descent of the east face of Gothic, which is that iconic face that you can see from Crested Butte Mountain Resort. We had a lot to talk about. This is a great episode. I hope you enjoy it, and let's go ahead and get to the show. Today on the Crested Butte is Home podcast, my guest is David Scheefer. So tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, I grew up in 10 miles from Lake Placid, New York. I was very fortunate to grow up where I did. I never realized how lucky I was to be able to bobsled, ski jump, skate, Nordic ski, and downhill ski. So I was a skier. My dad started me when I was 3 years old. He was a ski instructor, and I had always had a passion for skiing. So I went 2 years to junior college in upstate New York, and at the time, the Vietnam War was still going on. I was the last year for college deferments, and I decided to continue on with college so I could use my deferment. I wasn't too psyched about going to Vietnam at the time.
No, I reckon not.
My brother ended up going. Anyways, I transferred out to Western here because some other guys my age had come out here and raved about the skiing at Crested Butte and whatnot. So I arrived in the fall of 1970 and lived in the dorms the first year. I think the first year I skied Crested Butte, I paid $46 for a season pass and had my schedule arranged. So I skied typically 3 days during the week and a couple of days on the weekend, obviously.
Nice.
And that was before all that was there was the couple of buildings at the base area and the gondola. Anyways, I graduated from Western in 73 and moved up to Ohio City and lived in a old resort. My first wife and I rented for $35 a month. It had 7 cabins, which were had old wood cook stoves. There was no running water in the place at all, so we hauled our own water and whatnot, and lived there for a number of years. Anyways, being out of the mainstream of being able to ski at Monarch or Crested Butte, I bought a pair of Bona wood skis, 2400s, and some Alpha boots, and started touring up mostly old mining roads and whatnot, and learned to actually parallel on these 2400s, which there was a shop in Gunnison. It was the only mountaineer shop at the time that sold cross-country gears. It was Carroll's, Carroll's dad. So I toured around and had a lot of fun up there. Eventually, I ended up going up to Monarch and skiing up there on my Woodies and Alpha boots, and even coming up here a few times skiing on my leather Alpha boots and Woodies. And I can remember a lot of people were quite surprised to see somebody out on Nordic gear on the ski hill. Then in the winter of 83, 84, which people talk about, I went to a recent talk with Vandenbush, and he was saying that was perhaps one of the heaviest snow years that Gunnison's ever seen. I worked at Craner Hill. I loaded people on the lift. I was ski patrol. I did the grooming.
You do the dishes too, or
no? Anyways, two guys who were out there telemarking, and I could not figure out for the life of me what they were doing. It's like I'd never seen anybody telemark before. Because I was parallel skiing on my your skinny skis. Anyways,
with free heels too, so you could have been telemarking, but you didn't know that technique existed yet.
Correct.
Okay.
So I made friends with them, and we started. I got way into telemarking, and that's about the time. Obviously, Rick Borklevic and Craig Hall and a few other people were telemark. Also, then I got into telemark racing. I have a strong background of ski racing. I was was on the ski team in high school.
Back in Lake Placid, okay.
And back then, our high school traveled around the state. I raced against people like Billy the Kid and Hank Kashwa and whatnot, and we couldn't afford to send both Nordic skiers and alpine skiers, so that's where I really started Nordic skiing also. I didn't enjoy it that much at the time.
You'd rather go downhill back then.
I was into the gravity thing. Anyways, got into telemark racing and got to know a bunch of the people up here and started skiing up here more. Craig Hall and I have been good friends for a long time, and there was some other folks, Penelope Street, Julie Niels, Don Cook, Steve Cook, Kimberly Shepard, and a few others that I've stayed friends with through the years. And as you know, I got into doing the AJ also. A lot of people attribute, and it's not something I would like to be noted for, but most people attribute me to starting the costume craze for the Al Johnson, because I happened to be down in Montrose and saw a postal suit in a second-hand store there and bought it and wore it during the race. And
then the next year everyone had a costume.
The rest is history. Anyways, my son still has my my jacket.
Nice.
Postal jacket and
That's
whatnot.
Awesome.
And he's won the AJ also. Also, I had obviously a couple of kids when I lived in Ohio City and got them into Nordic skiing. Got on the ground level of Nordic up here. I was on the board for 20 years or so, and my aspect was I've dealt with trying to promote Nordic for the kids. I wanted to see that it was affordable and available to any kid in the valley. So I worked with the school to try to make it, and it became a recognized gym type class where people could credit. Do that instead of doing basketball or some other sport. And it's been super rewarding to see how Nordic has grown into the valley. It used to always run in the red, and actually after helping get the yurt out there and in place, it seemed like it started going into the black and whatnot, and I always felt like the yurt should be used, and it became a year-round deal, similar to Nordic system I spent some time with in Winthrop, where their trails are used as mountain bike trails in the summer as well as winter, so they're multi-use, which I would still like to see that happen here.
Oh, that would be really cool.
So there's not this wasted trail system, so to speak, in the summertime, that it could be something that could be used to the people that aren't technically advanced or whatever, that an exposure for them to be able to get out there on a bike and not have to ride technical stuff.
Well, and have a fun destination to go to and things like that too. So, well, let me stop you there, just because I want to go back to Lake Placid. So, obviously, Lake Placid, the first time they had the Olympics was what year?
1932.
Okay, and that's why you were able, living there, to do bobsled and all the, use some of the infrastructure that was there.
Yes, actually, Jim, one of the Morgans that announced the bobsledding for the Olympics in the last 20 years or so, him and I won the junior division, which was pretty cool. As far as the ski jumping, that was pretty much available to anybody, any kid there that had the daredevil attitude like I did, I guess, and they had the speed skating oval, and it's similar to what's happening here. I never realized that a lot of Olympians stayed and lived in that area and had bred a certain caliber of athleticism that I see happening here with people like Ingrid Butts and Rebecca Dussault and Brian Smith, and go down the list, and it's Dave Weens, and to see the next generation grow from that this valley, as you know, is becoming quite notorious for their athletes that I've always believed, and that you're a product of your environment, and when you grow up around here, maybe some of these kids don't quite realize it till they get older, that with the Nordic we have here and the ski hill and now hockey, that they're very fortunate. I've always felt sports is extremely important for kids. It teaches them discipline and teamwork. That I've read a lot of stuff that most kids that do sports are not only great athletes, they usually excel at educational levels. Some of it, they say, is because of the blood pumping through their system into their brain and whatnot. So,
well, just to keep going with that, I was going to save that for later, but I do your son Travis, I remember doing the Pinnacle mountain bike races, and I think one year, I don't know how old he was probably 15, and I could just barely hold him off, and then the next year he was gone with all the other fast guys. So there you go, there's another product who's very fast.
Yes, my son, obviously I'm very proud of my son. He's quite the athlete, and I've always felt also you got to provide an example. So I never realized till later years that me actually competing in the same races as my daughter and son was very inspirational and important to them.
Yeah.
That it motivated them to and it made things a lot easier as far as getting them out there doing it. Travis is signed up for the Growler and the 12 hours at Mesa Verde, which he's won a couple of times, and nice. So I'm psyched to see him get back into that
back into racing.
Yes.
Yeah. In this week's Crested Butte Real Estate Minute, I wanted to talk about selling vacant land. So if you own some land and you decided that you are ready to sell it or will be in the near future, you can give me a call by visiting CrestedButteRealEstateAgent.com, and my contact information is there. But some other thoughts would be that you might want to call a surveyor and get the corners of your lot marked. That can make it a lot easier for buyers to tell exactly where that property is, which, depending on the lot, can be pretty difficult to ascertain. And there's a lot more to marketing vacant land than I think sometimes you see out there. It's more than just throwing a couple pictures up. There are other techniques that can help buyers understand what kind of property you are selling. So if you want to talk about those, again, give me a call by visiting CrestedButteRealEstateAgent.com, and let's get back to the interview with David Scheefer. Well, let's backtrack a little bit. So we were talking about early days of telemark skiing and backcountry skiing. So you continue to do that. And from what someone told me, it sounds like you may have pioneered some of the big peaks around here. So maybe just tell us a little bit about some of the bigger descents that you particularly remember around here. I'd love to hear some of those stories.
Well, back in when we first started backcountry skiing, there was only a dozen people really doing it, and back then it was not a whole lot of knowledge out there as far as avalanches, and there was no beacons. We used avalanche cords, which you tied around your waist, and they went out 40 meters or so, and they had little directional arrows on them.
Basically just a string that you're tailing behind you. Uh-huh.
And so I am very fortunate probably to be alive still at sometimes our way of testing the slope was to find a big rock and throw it down into the slope we were going to ski. So, yes, I've skied a number of, I would say, peaks and whatnot that I probably pioneered. I did all of Fossil Ridge Range, Square Top and Bronco and Cross Mountain, and when I was living in Ohio City there.
Those still don't get much use, I'm sure of that.
No, and at one time we were into doing the domes, Tamichi Dome, Razor Creek Dome, Cochetope Dome. I revisited Tamichi Dome this year, which was way cool for me.
Were those getting snow regularly back then? Because I feel like these days you kind of have to have a pretty good year to ski.
You do.
Okay.
Most of those we did in the big year, 83, 84. Okay. That boy, it was similar to this year. We were skiing a lot of the sagebrush stuff up around Pitkin and stuff, skiing probably 50-degree stuff and whatnot. That also skied Fairview Peak, which is a 13er, which since then they've redone the fire tower out there, but the one guy living in Ohio City at the time sat up there for, he was a fire ranger and experienced like 12 or 13 lightning strikes till it finally...
On top of that peak,
till I had dismantled the building up there. And I don't know, did some stuff down around Lake City, off Slumgullion. Back in the day also they had the speed skiing down in Silverton that we would go down for that and skied off some stuff down there according to some of the locals that had never been skied before.
Is that like kind of near where the ski area is now, like that Velocity Basin and all that?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
and how about here in Crested Butte? Someone mentioned that you skied the east face of Gothic. Do you remember what year that was?
Boy, I do not, but I would say I was. I would say I was the first one to ski that. I remember people told me it was not skiable. That probably made me want to do it even more. So.
That sounds like Bill Briggs with the Grand Teton right there. Everyone said that's not possible. But and that was done again with these leather boots, or is this a little later and maybe
a little later, yes. But basically narrow skis, yes.
A plastic boot yet, or still just a leather boot?
A leather boot, Steinkampfs.
Steinkampfs.
I don't know if you remember
Steinkampfs. No.
Steinkampfs were boots, old buckle boots, Hinkies, and Garmont, a few others that we'd take down to the shoemaker in Gunnison. John Boxley was his name, and he would take the sole off and put a Telmark sole on it.
Really, the duckbill. You'd actually have to go and get a cobbler, so to speak, to put on a duckbill for tallness.
Yes.
Wow.
And so some of the lace-up leather boots and some of the later buckle leather boots were pretty beefy. So
in comparison, at least.
You would have to break them in as far as they didn't really want to bend too well, so you'd spray them with alcohol and water, and then tie them or wire them so they had the crease in where you wanted them.
Over the top of your foot?
Yes.
Because otherwise it would pinch your toes, right? And you
right.
would go to, okay.
So it was more on the ball of your foot, over the center of the ball of your foot. And at one point, people discovered, I think Craig Hall was probably the first one, that jumping boots worked quite well, because when jumpers land, they're in the Telmark position.
Right, and they're actually even graded on that. That's part of the score of Nordic jumping, huh?
And to go back really in ancient history, my dad was more or less a pioneer of skiing, and around that area. He just died on March 30th. He was 98, but he was skiing before there was lifts, so literally they were telemarking back then, because they had to have a type of binding that allowed them to strap on their seal skin, snake skin, to climb, and they would cut trails on the present day Whiteface Mountain where they've had the Olympics.
Oh wow, really cool, really cool. What about these days? Are you still doing telemark, or have you been converted to AT like so many others?
I am doing AT. That I worked at Christie Sports for 7 years, tuning skis, and we had access to buying silverettas, which were kind of the first primitive AT bindings, and Salawas, which were a plate binding. So we got a pro deal on those, and I started using those silverettas with, not many people realize, but Scott put out a super lightweight boot that was a one-buckle boot that I would use with my silverettas. Most of like Hexels and these Scott boots were a spin-off from space age technology.
I think I've seen these Scott boots. They were a rear entry boot, right? Or sort of.
Yes.
They kind of looked like it, right?
Yeah. And so started using those, climbing these peaks and whatnot. Back then, we were using what were called snake skins. They were put out by the same people that do volet straps.
Okay.
They were a plastic skin.
Oh, yeah, I remember, yeah.
That you strapped on with these volet type fasteners onto your bottom. And so we thought we were...
Thought that was pretty good at the time.
Pretty good at the time. Otherwise, we were using wax for doing a lot of our climbing, which there was a product called Jackrabbit, and it was basically pine tar and wax that we would use to climb with.
And you could still scrape it off at the top. That's basically
hopefully.
I was going to say, I'm picturing that just sticking to the bottom.
That it would typically discolor a ski bottom if it was light colored. It was pretty permanent stuff. And actually, sideline story, Jack Rabbit Johannesson, who developed that wax, lived in that area. I grew up, and he was quite famous. He skied well into his 90s, 5K a day or whatnot.
Yeah, no, the name's
and
definitely
they have
familiar.
a trail system back there called the Jack Rabbit Trail, which I've done when I go back there. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I am somewhat of a ski historian, that I do have a collection of skis and memorabilia. My one friend who's in her 80s has given me a lot of cool stuff. A banner from the 32 Olympics and a few other things. And anyways, it's she and some other people attribute where I actually grew up is called Saranac Lake, New York. It's older than Lake Placid. They attribute that to the birthplace of skiing in the States, that it used to be a TB curing center. People would sit out on these exposed decks in 20 and 30 below weather and breathe in the clean air to rid themselves of TB, because TB was quite common then, because in the cities and whatnot they were burning coal and other stuff. And the story goes that a Canadian came down and was taking the cure and got out there on what were called snowshoes at the time. But that's a little bit of the history of where I grew up. I know I'm bouncing all over the place.
That's good. I love it. You know, you talked about Johansson and kept skiing, and you're obviously still skiing. I mean, do you feel good still going skiing? Or do you miss the old days when you were younger and probably a little faster? Are you just loving getting out still today?
My concept and my pleasure of what I do skiing has changed. What I enjoy more than skiing some steep, gnarly peak, which I enjoy just getting out and what I call adventure skiing. Just skiing Swampy Pass or what I call the outer limits out at Hartman's, which is, I term the lonely hills out there, that it's really fun for me to go out in those areas where I don't encounter other people and whatnot. And I fortunately grew up with my grandfather, who was one of the last real woodsmen in that area, and he taught me trapping and hunting, and I find it really fun to go out there and see mountain lion tracks or see a mountain lion. Or he taught me not to fear that stuff, and I don't fear going out there and being miles and miles away from stuff and encountering wildlife or whatever.
Sure.
I've had some pretty unique experiences with running into bears and whatnot. That
well, let's hear an experience then. Do you have a good story with one of those?
Boy, I have several. I've this one gulch called Bear Gulch, which obviously is named appropriately.
Where's that at?
Above Ohio City.
Okay.
I ran into a cub and its mother, and actually she more or less tracked me up to a point where I was able to stand behind a tree and be like 15 feet away from this sow. That obviously she didn't feel threatened by my presence. I've been told I have a certain knack with animals and
You're
dogs.
the bear whisperer.
Yeah. And I love telling this story. My grandfather used to set traps out in the dump where he had a camp at the base of Whiteface, because back then people didn't take stuff to the dump. They just threw it over the bank, and he'd set these big bear traps. And I believe I was 12 years old at the time, and he caught a cub in one of the traps, and it was out there crying, and the sow was circling around out there. Anyways,
Sure.
He handed me the 308 Pump Savage and said, and he had a big bar to pry open the trap. Most people don't realize how difficult it is actually to set one of those things. And he told me if the mother charged us, I was going to have to shoot it. So he freed the cub. The mother never charged us. And obviously the cub was a three-legged bear for however long it survived. That, boy, at 12, I didn't think that much of it. I thought that was a common experience. Not till later years I realized how much my grandfather didn't talk much, that just how much I picked up from watching him and whatnot. Yeah. So I feel very fortunate in that respect also.
And you're, I'm sure, passed down a lot of those things to your kids as well. So well, let's switch subjects a little bit. You've been here for a long time. What were you doing for work during all these years?
Boy,
or is the question, what didn't you do for work over all those years?
Yes, back in the day, to live here, you had to be multi-faceted. I worked in 4 different sawmills as what's called the off-bear, which is the guy that takes the lumber off the end and stacks it out in the yard.
Oh, wow.
Tremendously hard work.
That
Probably the
really
hardest
hard.
work I've ever done. There was a couple of sawmills
Were these up
out
Quartz
by
Creek?
Parlin.
Okay, so yeah.
A guy's name was Sebring that had the sawmill, and he was sawing out 4x4s for CF&I and Pueblo. There was a sawmill in Pitkin I worked some at, and a sawmill in Ohio City, and a sawmill out in Doyleville, which, as you know, all of them have
I was going to say, there's nothing in any of those at all.
And sometimes I'd cut corral poles. I'd get a permit and cut corral poles. I think I was getting $1 a pole for those, so I could go up and cut 50 or 60 of those a day and get them loaded up.
That was probably pretty good at the time.
Yes, which takes me back to living in Ohio City. Bought a piece of land finally, and built my own log cabin. And back then you could get a permit for $5, a logging permit. So I got a logging permit, and working in these sawmills, I had access to a logging truck and access to the mill itself. So I built a log cabin, and Jan, my first wife, and I lived in that for a long time.
Is that right there in downtown, so
Yes.
to speak, Ohio City? Okay,
Yes.
cool. You have any idea what the square foot cost of that cabin was, just for fun?
I think I probably built that cabin for under $2,000. I mean, yeah, $2,000.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Wow. Awesome.
That I had to buy some spikes and material to chink it and whatnot, but the roofing material, but all the wood, the rafters and all that were stuff I logged out.
For your $5 permit.
Yes.
Cool. So that's some logging, but then what else have you done over all these years?
So, in the interim, there used to be a restaurant in Ohio City called the Gold Creek Inn.
I heard that was amazing food. Is this?
Yes.
I've heard it was like 5-star or something.
Yes, it
wow.
was pretty noted. There was quite a few write-ups in Denver paper as far as the color weekends in the fall to hit that and drive over Cumberland Pass and through Taylor Park and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And my friend Joe Bench, he was a chef in the service and went to school in Hyde Park called the CIA, was the Culinary Institute of America. And so in the course of 3 years, he would hire me to restore what was originally the post office in Ohio City. I think we found some papers dating back to 1920 that we ended up salvaging and wallpapering the bathrooms with.
Awesome.
And it was my first encounter with working with these log places that were set on rocks and whatnot.
Right,
and
no
putting
foundation.
a foundation. And I started doing more carpentry stuff, which when I was, my grandfather was a quote-unquote craftsman, which I consider myself, because the true definition of a craftsman is beyond carpentry. It's when you put your heart and soul and creative juices into your project. And so worked on the Gold Creek Inn on and off for 3 years. Worked with a couple of ranchers there who did foundations under buildings in Pitkin, because a lot of those were set on wooden blocks and whatnot.
Sure.
And so got into doing that. Obviously, I mentioned I worked at Craner Hill at one winter, but mostly, there wasn't a whole lot of jobs in the winter here that people had to lay pretty low, as far as people couldn't afford to do construction in the winter like they do now.
Back then,
so occasionally I would do some remodels, shoveled a lot of roofs, and made money that way. Started, Steve Capilucci was up for dinner one night at the Gold Creek Inn because it was, like you were saying, it was quite famous for people from Crested Butte would even drive up there. And he had a couple of rooms to rent that upstairs that I had renovated and whatnot, and they would come up, and he was walking up the street, and actually he went to school at the same time I did, and I knew who he was and whatnot, and anyways, he was quite impressed with my log cabin. And another building I did was a dovetailed sauna that I did. Didn't have running water, lived without running water up there for 18 years, which people would have a hard time living without a cell phone now.
I know, right?
Anyways, he offered me a job. It was for this guy called Pitkin Sam's, who owned the property below the dam there, which is all fenced off. And
the Taylor Dam?
Yes,
okay.
That's actually a placer mining claim this guy bought back, I believe, in the 50s. So he literally owned the bottom and whatnot. That's why he can fence that off.
Fence off the entire river, sure.
Anyways, he was building more or less a compound, so to speak. He had several guest cabins. He had a shop. He had completed it, but he was building a building for the maids and whatnot, kind of fashioned after where I grew up, or what's called the Great Camps. The Great Camps were these summer retreats from people from New York, Bloomingdale's, Rockefeller, and whatnot would build these outrageous camps. They weren't really camps. They were beyond camps.
Right.
And so started up there, and since then, I mostly have worked on, for lack of a better word, trophy homes in the valley. I was very fortunate to get in on that aspect, because it's allowed me to do a lot of creative stuff.
You get to.
I've done a lot of custom stone fireplaces. Actually, I was probably one of the few people in the valley that could actually build a firebox. And it's kind of a lost art.
I think usually those are just bought and thrown into a space.
And done a lot of tile work, metal work, log work, timber work.
You've done it all.
And back when I was working in Taylor, back then, basically you did the foundation, the sometimes the drywall, everything, because it was the only way to keep yourself busy.
Right.
So I learned a lot of talents, which I've employed still on these remodels, where I don't have to bring in a drywaller or a taper or texture guy, that I can do all that stuff myself. I guess the highlight of my career has been working at the Castleton Ranch up Ohio Creek, which allowed me to really challenge myself. I was in a management position up there. I had started this timber frame company called Combined Timber Craft, which my friend Chris Lennox still has down on the end of by the airport there. I was offered a job up there, more or less managing and still working, and I felt that was more of a challenge than actually putting beams and whatnot together. Experience of remodeling the Gold Creek Inn and working on some of these older cabins really came into play, because basically they dump a load of logs out there and give you a blueprint, and here's what we want you to do. And so my definition of creativity changed to the fact that I think for me, real creativeness, it comes from being handed more or less sometimes a pile of junk and creating something beautiful out of it. For me, working at the Castleton was like I got to work literally hand in hand with some world-class artists that would do these projects, and they had the skill to create the project, the hand-forged glass risers, the brass rods, sand-cast brass rods, and whatnot, and installing them, and working hand-in-hand with these guys and being able to gain their perception of how they perceived art and lines and whatnot, because I never, growing up, I went to Catholic school, and we didn't have any art. It was all religion. Working with Cappellucci and a few of these other guys through the years, that it's been really fun for me.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't know, Castleton is it's just all those beautiful buildings that you see if you drive up Ohio Creek from Gunnison towards Ohio Pass, and there's a whole series of them, and they're all kind of they have a style, and it's obviously just a gorgeous ranch in one of the best valleys I think around. Ohio Creek is pretty awesome. Well, let's start to wrap it up. We could talk all day. This has been a great interview. I really appreciate it. But the Gunnison Valley is home for you. Why do you still choose to make this your home?
Boy, I was thinking about that driving up here, that I came out here when I was 20 years old. Literally, I've grown up here in my mind. Obviously I grew up in Saranac Lake. Because I grew up there, the feeling and the reason I was there was totally different than the reason I'm here. That it's pretty hard to replace lifelong friends that I've known for 30 or 40 years, that they know my craziness and my moods and whatnot. Sometimes I'm not the easiest guy to get along with on the job site, because I demand more out of people than they realize they can give me sometimes. So that's part of it. I feel like living in a couple of other places for short term in Washington and Paonia and whatnot, that the sense of the mountains here and the sense of the fact that we have access to 6 different wilderness pretty close by, it's relatively untainted, a lot of the areas that I go to. The West Elks, I've seen in my lifetime Fossil Ridge go from non-wilderness to wilderness. Boy, it's a special place. It really is.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's so much more to explore. That I was laughing the other day going when I was climbing Tamichi Dome. As I get older, I gain more of an insight to how special this place is, that there's certain things like I see now that I didn't see when I was a kid. Obviously, we have an amazing mountain bike system. We have great Nordic. We have some of the best backcountry access to skiing that there is. How many places can you drive to the trailhead on Kepler Pass and jump out and be on top of a mountain in a couple hours? That typically it takes a lot more to access that.
Well, it's interesting what you said about I guess connections would be the word that I would use. The longer you're here and the more you bike and you ski and you hike and do all these things, you start to realize how connected all these different areas are, and you have this memory bank of different things that you remember. And for me, I've only been here 20 some years, but I constantly see that as I live here and evolve with it. But That was kind of a ramble, I guess. But well, anyway, let's wrap it up. So, final question: who else should I interview?
Boy, like I mentioned earlier before Dave Moe, he was pretty instrumental in the mountain bike thing.
From Rock and Roll Sports, yeah.
Yes.
Dave Moe would be awesome.
Boy, there's a couple other people, but unfortunately they're so reclusive, you'd never get them.
I'd never get them to talk.
Sit down here and talk to you.
Fair enough.
There's and one of my dear friends who I did a lot of telemark exploring and skiing and ice skating on Blue Mesa with in the 70s and whatnot, died a few years ago. So he would have been a good candidate. The other couple of guys, it seems like as you get older, some of my friends get quite subterranean. I only see them once in a blue moon, you know, that they kind of probably more like me. They go out and do their thing, but they don't involve other people.
Well, Dave Moe's a great choice, and I guess in our conversation, I should talk to Craig Hall again. And I've talked to him before about the heli skiing that used to happen here in Crested Butte and in Marble, and I'm sure. I think he'd sit down with me again. He'd be a good interview too.
Yes, he would.
But we'll stick with Dave Moe because I really love to talk to him about early days of mountain biking and at Hartman's and elsewhere. So, well, anyway, thank you so much for joining me and chatting, and I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to the Crested Butte is Home podcast with me, Frank Consella. And just as a reminder, you can catch all the older episodes by visiting crestedbutteshome.com. or on your favorite podcast player. You can find all the back catalog there. And if you enjoy the show, do me a quick favor and send it to somebody. Share it with them so that they can discover this podcast as well. I'd really appreciate that. I will see you again in another couple weeks. Thanks again.